כעת אני מתכבדת להזמין את השגריר סלאי מרידור, חבר בחבר השופטים של הפרס ולשעבר שגריר ישראל בוושינגטון, להציג את המרצה האורח.
ערב טוב, תודה רבה. ברשותכם אני לכבוד האורח אעבור לאנגלית, גם כהכנה לקראת הדברים שלנו. It is a great pleasure to introduce to you a very, very dear friend, Elliot Abrams. In 2013, Elliot published a book which he dedicated to his wife, Rachel, who died that year, with the words, "For Rachel, of course." The book was named Tested by Zion. And I don't know who would pass Rachel's test of love of Zion, but I can tell you from the experience of a former ambassador of Israel to the United States that Elliot Abrams passed the test of Zion with great distinction. And to be Israel's ambassador in the US when Elliot was in the White House was a very unique experience. And to come to the White House with Elliot inside was feeling like being at home. And you can just imagine what it means beyond the feeling when on the table are issues like how to fight terror, win the second intifada, or make sure that Syria will not have nuclear weapons. Elliot is very unique. Elliot is so unique as a human being. As a matter of fact, if his kids were here, he would not be concerned about the future of the Jewish people, and they would make, just by their presence, a much better introduction. But in terms of foreign policy, he is an extraordinary example for the very unique combination that is very unique to the US of bringing values and interests together. And in his new book of 2017, named Realism and Democracy, he explains, against some common wisdom, that not only that values are not contradicting interests, but values are critical to national strength and can serve in advancing interests. There's so much I can tell you about Elliot, and I want you to hear Elliot, so I will not speak for long. About his mind, you can learn from his graduation of London Schools of Economics and Harvard Law School, and his advice and his essays and books. But about his soul, about his heart, you can learn from the path he chose in life. As I said before, the family he raised, but the path, at the same time, the path he chose in life. He was working for two Democrats on the Hill, Jackson and Moynihan, who were the patrons of, at the same time, freedom and national security. He was working for two presidents, Reagan and Bush 43, who shared his beliefs in the values, in the importance of national security, in the greatness of America, and in Israel. And in his free time, when he chose what to do, just of the list, he was the former president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, former chairman of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, former board member of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and currently is engaged in organizations that are dedicated to the future of the Jewish people. And his 2016 essay about the relationship between Israel and world Jewry, and world Jewry in Israel, a matter that is the core of this prize, was not only deep, but daring in suggesting somewhat a reverse correlation, not only that Israel is blamed to be not that Israel is claimed to be the responsible for the distancing of world Jewry from Israel, but maybe that distancing from Judaism and from the Jewish people may cause people to distance themselves from the state of Israel. Elliot writes and speaks, but so do many. And thinking about him, I'm reminded of an experience I had in New York years ago when I was a Beitar Shaliach, and I met with revisionists, old revisionists, my age now, and they used to tell me, many of them, I knew Jabotinsky. So one of them came to me on the side and said, all of them knew Jabotinsky, but Jabotinsky knew me. So many people write and many people speak, but Elliot is read and listened to. So it is with great pleasure and friendship that I'm proud to introduce to you my dear friend, an American statesman, a lover of Zion, Elliot Abrams.
Thank you, Salai. Now, the problem is, after an introduction like that, what can you do? First, I want to congratulate the winners of this prize and congratulate B'nai B'rith for inventing the prize and giving the prize. It's an important subject, and it continues B'nai B'rith getting on toward 2 centuries of knitting the Jewish world together. It's a pleasure for me to be in Jerusalem, but you know this is a pleasure that the majority of American Jews have never had, not once. And that's something I'd like to talk about tonight, as I talk about the relationship between Israel and American Jews now on the 70th year of Israel's independence. You hear very often American Jews and Israel are drifting apart. I think that's correct, and in some ways inevitable. The place to begin, I think, is to note the gap between reality and American Jews' common image of themselves as a community imbued with love of Israel. This is not accurate, and really never was. American Jewish leaders were, for many decades, dubious about Zionism, or even opposed to it. As Daniel Gordis wrote recently, honesty compels acknowledging that, especially at the highest levels of organized American Jewry, the embrace of Israel has historically often been incomplete, hesitant, or faltering. Compare American Jews with Jews in England or Canada or Australia, and we look pretty bad. 70% of Canadian Jews, 80% of Australian Jews, 95% of British Jews have visited Israel at least once. In the US, even with birthright, the number is 40%. Moreover, other diaspora Jews not only visit Israel, they vote Israel. They tend to cast their votes for a political party that supports Israel. And they have switched allegiance in recent decades to help elect, thank you, for example, the Liberal Party in Australia, or Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Stephen Harper in Canada. By comparison, there's very little political mobility among non-Orthodox Jews in the United States. So, let us not sentimentalize and exaggerate past levels of American Jewish support for Israel, or even current levels. Still, those levels are falling. There are some logical reasons. The first one is demography, or maybe we should say ethnography. As Martin Kramer has written, in 1948, American and Israeli Jews were Landsleute. They or their parents had come from the same cities, towns, shtetls of Europe. American Jews looked at Israeli Jews like family, and often they were. Almost everyone in Israel had some allegedly rich uncle or cousin in America. As for the political leaders, most were born in Russia or Poland. From David Ben-Gurion through Golda Meir, Menachem Begin through Yitzhak Shamir, Levi Eshkol could hardly refrain from slipping into Yiddish in cabinet meetings. All that has changed. Today, over half of all Israeli Jews identify themselves as being of Sephardi or Mizrahi descent, less than half European or American descent. On top of this, about 70% of Israeli Jews are Israeli born. Israel is no longer primarily a nation of immigrants. Close quote. That's first. The second reason is American Jews and Israelis live very different lives. You may recall the phrase by Robert Kagan a few years ago. Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus. By which he meant that Americans are accustomed to having and using power, including military power. And today's Europeans are not. But I would argue that Israelis are also from Mars, and American Jews are from Venus. Like the majority of Americans, American Jews are largely uninvolved with America's military, which is a volunteer military. And many wince at Israel's displays of power, for example, along the Gaza border in May. American Jews live in a country that is secure and has secure borders and friendly neighbors. For all too many American Jews, the hopes kindled by the Middle East peace process remain alive. And the reality of a Palestinian national movement that has collapsed into corruption and misrule and extremism is a reality that they can overlook. Life in Israel is very different. Security issues and the role of the military are unavoidably much greater. Third, the American principle and style of separation of church and state is simply inapplicable here in Israel. Fourth, and now we come to something that Salai mentioned, and I'm glad he stopped because I thought you were going to steal this from me. The sense of Jewish identity and Jewish peoplehood in the American Jewish community is quite plainly declining. This is not the case for those who remain religiously observant. The 10% who are Orthodox, and perhaps another 5% who, whatever their denominational affiliation, practice the Jewish religion with some dedication. This matters. As Daniel Gordis wrote, Jews throughout the centuries regularly and reflexively invoked the past in a way that made it always present and real to them. No matter where they lived or what they did, what they said, what they were thinking about, the land of Israel remained a central focus of their consciousness. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of Jewish religious practices that kept the dream of Zion alive for generations of Jews who had never seen the land and knew they never would. That helps explain why, in 1896, Theodor Herzl's Zionist vision, articulated in The Jewish State, fell on such receptive ears and was published in 7 languages in that year alone. For many Jews, Herzl was simply giving political shape to a dream they had cultivated for centuries. Close quote. Adherence to the Jewish religion may not be a critical part of Israeli identity, at least not for a sizable percentage of Israelis. that will not lead to assimilation into a Christian or other majority, or weakening of communal solidarity, or a declining sense of peoplehood and commitment to the national future here, not here. I believe one can see this in the remarkable birth rate here, which is rising and is the only such case among OECD countries. Indeed, it is just about double the OECD average. In the United States, Orthodox Jews also have a birth rate far above the national average and, of course, the Jewish average. But for the rest of the community, Jewish identity and loyalties, a sense of commitment to Jewish peoplehood, and a common future are being eroded fast by intermarriage. The intermarriage rate among non-Orthodox Jews is now about 70%. This number, which is steadily rising, helps explain why polls show that younger Jews are less supportive of Israel. Is it primarily because they don't like the Likud, or they don't like Netanyahu, or they don't like settlements in the West Bank? I don't think so. The American academic Doug Glassman admitted in a book a couple of years ago, a book that actually did blame the gap between Israel and American Jews mostly on political differences. He admitted the following about intermarriage. Quote, "Perhaps the biggest reason why young American Jews tend to be more dovish and more critical of Israel is because they are much more likely than older Jews to be the offspring of intermarried couples. Young American Jews whose parents are intermarried are not only more liberal than other Jews, but also significantly less attached to Israel." Close quote. That should not be so surprising. Lawrence Hoffman, a scholar at the Reform Jewish Seminary in New York, and himself a prominent Reform rabbi, wrote, "The disappearance of the sort of ethnic solidarity that prior generations enjoyed as a matter of course, and our high intermarriage rate means that the next generation of Jews will increasingly be people with no childhood Jewish memories and no obvious reason to maintain Jewish friends, associations, and causes at the expense of non-Jewish ones." Close quote. And among those causes will be Israel. A study by the Pew Research Center found that persons of Jewish background, this is the category, persons of Jewish background, mainly those with one Jewish parent, express significantly lower level of support for Israel than the category called Jews by religion. Same for the sense of Jewish peoplehood, according to this study. 20% of Jews with a non-Jewish spouse say they are raising their children exclusively as Jews. When asked if they have a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people, 59% say yes, as against 92% of those married to Jews. Put simply, as ethnicity fades, religion becomes even more important in sustaining the American Jewish community. But a growing portion of the American Jewish community does not practice the religion at all, and a large majority marry non-Jews, and so do an even larger majority of the children of intermarried couples. These are what Pew calls, this is a very interesting category, Jews of no religion. Jews of no religion. That category may work here in Israel. You can call it Jews who are, or Israelis who are secular, because they will remain Israelis and they will remain Jews. But in the United States, Jews of no religion are very unlikely to pass that membership in a distinct people down to their children and grandchildren. If the first generation were Jewish immigrants, and the second, the children of the immigrants were just plain American Jews, and the third generation are now Jews of no religion, we can be sure that in many cases the fourth generation will be gone. They will be Americans of no religion who have a Jewish ancestor. Today, 1 in 5 Jews in the United States say they have no religion. Among millennials, the figure is 1/3. And among them, among millennials who say they are Jews of no religion, 2/3 are not raising their children as Jews. What does this portend? First, a smaller American Jewish community. The low birth rate and high intermarriage among the non-Orthodox mean that American Jews will continue to decline as a percentage of the American people. Jews were once over 3% of the US population, but now have fallen to below 2% by most estimates. Second, it probably portends a more observant American Jewish community that's quite committed to Israel. As Jews at the margins of the community disappear, melting into American society, those who remain will be more committed, more active, more dedicated to Jewish peoplehood, more likely to practice the religion, more likely to feel a strong attachment to Israel. But what of the influence of that community? If it's smaller, will its clout diminish? That may be right. It depends in part on how the community is geographically distributed and whether there are sufficient numbers of Jews in key states, key congressional districts, to make them critical voters and especially critical swing voters. I do worry about the data showing an increasing partisan division in the United States over Israel. A Pew poll this January showed 79% of Republicans sympathizing more with Israel than with the Palestinians, compared with 27% of Democrats. That's a huge and growing gap. Sooner or later, many Democratic politicians will respond to their electoral base, and their level of support for Israel will decline. The good news, of course, is that there is another and far larger source of support for Israel in the United States: the evangelicals. There are about 5 million Jews in the United States. There are about 75 to 85 million evangelicals. Ambassador David Friedman, who spoke here last year, noted recently that evangelical Christians, quote, support Israel with much greater fervor and devotion than many in the Jewish community, close quote. The largest pro-Israel organization in the United States is not AIPAC, with 100,000 members. It's Christians United for Israel, with 4 million members. And it's not only an American phenomenon. It's clear that evangelical influence had something to do with the Latin American nations who have said they will move their embassies to Jerusalem. Poll data shows that overall support for Israel in the United States is steady. Very steady and very high. But the composition of that support is changing. More of it's on the right, less of it is found on the left. Perhaps this is in some part because you have had right-of-center governments for 17 years, since Ariel Sharon became prime minister in 2001. People on the left in the United States, including people like Barack Obama, generally favor the Labor Party and other parties left of center here and everywhere. So perhaps, if someday there is a more centrist or center or left of center coalition in power here, the American left and American Democrats will feel more supportive of its decisions, but I doubt it. My own view is that they will be quite surprised to find that such a government does not behave very differently on many security issues, such as what to do about the Iranian presence in Syria or Hamas's attacks from Gaza. So I do not think that a change in government here would have a deep impact on support for Israel in the United States after the shock wears off. It would not affect the deeper trends, such as evangelical support for Israel or American Jewish assimilation. Is there anything can be done to increase or solidify American Jewish support for Israel? Well, I am a strong supporter of Birthright, Taglit. It's a wonderful program. But if there is one clear and tested antidote to assimilation, it is Jewish education. Not one afternoon a week or an hour or two, which is what I had a few years ago, but full-time. American Jews have a far lower rate of attendance at Jewish schools than other diaspora communities, in good part because it's too expensive. In most other diaspora communities, there is some government support for such schools, on the theory that the government money should follow the child to whatever school he or she attends. Not in the United States. In no small part because Jews have for several generations fought against such support. That must change. And I'd also argue that Jewish philanthropy should focus far more on education. But I would like to raise the Israeli side of this equation. The relationship between Israel and American Jews, the largest community in the diaspora by very far, depends in part on what Israelis decide. For years, we have read that someday Israel will become the center of world Jewish life. For centuries, it was Europe. Then for about a century, it was the United States. Now it's here. And that will not change as other Jewish communities diminish in size, and most will, and the population of Israel grows. At a conference on anti-Semitism here a few weeks ago, the Minister of Diaspora Affairs said, quote, "The Jews came to fight with us, to fly our planes when we didn't know how to procure equipment. Now it's our turn to give back," close quote. And he added, "What keeps me up at night is not the enemies at our borders. What keeps me up at night is the future of the Jews abroad," close quote. An American writer who heard him speak later wrote that the real reason you're here, Bennett seemed to say to diaspora Jews in the audience, is because we've eclipsed you and because we are succeeding where you are beginning to fail. You have helped us, but now we are going to help you. Israel at age 70, with a population 10 times what it was in 1948, a powerful military, a series of significant alliances, a prosperous economy by any global standard, now has the largest Jewish community in the world. You have for much of those 7 decades depended on the diaspora for immigrants and for political and financial support, the latter especially coming from the American Jewish community. In the coming decades, you will grow, and the American Jewish community will decline in size. You don't really need our money anymore. If it is correctly estimated at $1.5 to $2 billion a year in American Jewish philanthropy, that is slightly below the level, adjusting for inflation, slightly below the level raised in 1973. In 1973, Israel's GDP was $10 billion, and last year it was $320 billion. And GDP per capita has gone up by a factor of 10. A new study of Israeli Jews found, first, virtually all Israeli Jews affirm they have a strong sense of belonging to the Jewish people. Second, 3/4 of Israeli Jews say a strong and thriving American Jewry is important for the future of Israel. Third, 3/4 feel that Jews in Israel and Jews in the United States share a common destiny. And 6 out of 10 say that Jews in Israel and American Jews should be responsible for one another's welfare to a great extent. They are also supportive of mutual education, bringing American Jews to Israel, and government funding of young Israeli Jews to experience Jewish life in America, close quote. That's the positive side. The study also found that 3 out of 5 Israelis reject the idea of taking into account the views of American Jewish leaders with respect to religious pluralism. So the study concludes, the most serious challenge to American Jewish the most serious challenge to Israel-American Jewry relationship, the Israel-American Jewry relationship, is at the practical level. The relationship is deeply affected by basic schisms of religion and politics within Israeli society. While there is broad appreciation for solidarity and a sense of common destiny, on the other hand, there is uneasiness with American Jews participating actively in Israeli life. So what does it mean to be the center of world Jewish life? Not a recipient of aid from, but a donor to diaspora Jews. Perhaps you should do what the French do in their 800 Alliances Françaises in 137 countries, or what the Germans do in their 159 Goethe Institutes in 98 countries, or what the Chinese do in their 480 Confucius Institutes around the world, except not the spying. That they also do, without the spying. What am I talking about? I'm talking about teaching Hebrew and teaching about Israel. Then there is the religious question, which was visible, of course, in the quarrel about the Kotel. If Israel is the center of world Jewish life, what do you do about the fact that Jews around the world have varying levels of observance and of commitment to traditional Judaism? What steps should Israel take? What compromises, what sacrifices to advance the relationship between diaspora Jews and Israel? And then there are the issues that stem inevitably from the existence now of a Jewish state. Israel is a state, and all states must practice at least an element of realpolitik. But what if mamlachtiut affects the interests of diaspora Jews? What if the mamlachtiut is about Israel's diplomatic or economic interests, not about security matters? What then is the balance between the problems of the diaspora and the interests of the state of Israel? On real security issues, my own view is simple. None. Don't balance. If protecting Israel and Israelis from Hamas at the Gaza border, for example, causes discomfort to some Jews overseas, too bad. Your lives and safety outweigh their discomfort. Your first obligation to world Jewry is to survive and to thrive. But then what? Beyond security issues, to ask the question again, what does it mean to be the center of world Jewish life? What are your goals? And what are your responsibilities toward those smaller Jewish communities? Some of them, of course, physically safe, Australia, Canada, US. Others, from Sweden to France to Argentina, for example, far less safe. You exist as a haven with a law of return. But that is the beginning and not the end, surely, of Israel's role in the lives of Jewish communities around the world. For Israel today, celebrating 70 years, even the Jews in the United States now live in one of those smaller diaspora communities that will inevitably look to Zion for inspiration, for assistance, and for a guide to our common future as Jews. I don't have the answers. I suspect you don't either. But I believe these are the right questions on this 70th anniversary year. And it gives us something to argue about for the next 70 years. So thank you again, Salah.
Thank you, Mr. Abrams. נסיים את הערב עם שיר נוסף. אני מזמינה את רוני כהן, לבמה.
יכולים לשיר איתי, כיף. עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. יעשה שלום, יעשה שלום, שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל. תודה רבה לכם.